introduction. So my name is Cristian Alecsa. I am a technical a researcher at the Technical University of Cluj-Napoca and the Romanian Institute of Science and Technology. And today I will talk about new method for density ratio estimation that I have developed for the cases when one has access to multiple train and test data sets. It is called G-KMM because it is a generalization of the Kernel mean matching method. In fact, in the scientific literature, the idea of density ratio estimation is well studied because the sample weights obtained from the density ratio function are used in the so-called importance weighting. This means that when we have a train and a test data set with different distribution, we must adapt the train distribution to the test one. The contents of this presentation are the following. I will briefly talk about KMM and RuleSieve. These are the basic density ratio methods. And then I will try to delve into the idea in which manner we can extend the kernel mean matching case to the situations when we have access to multiple train or test data sets. And also I will talk a little bit about the alpha mixture density ratio. After that, I will finalize with the generalized KMM method and with some experiments that I have done on some synthetic data sets. The most well-known algorithm for density ratio estimation is the kernel mean matching, which depends actually on the maximum mean discrepancy statistic. There are various extensions to this algorithm, like the efficient sampling KMM and also ensemble KMM. These are two different algorithms. The ensemble KMM utilizes multiple non-overlapping test subsets, while efficient sampling KMM uses a bootstrap aggregation process, but for the training data. And both of these were recently combined into the so-called SKMM method. It is known that there are very different alternatives to KMM, for example, ULSIF and relative ULSIF or RuleSieve. The last one, RuleSieve, doesn't use the classical density ratio function, but an extended one which involves a mixture of the densities between the training and the test distributions. I also want to say a little bit about a newly developed method called multi-distribution density ratio estimation, which has the goal to estimate the density ratios between multiple pair of distributions. Now, for the KMM method, we said that it is based on the MMD statistic. In fact, the MMD statistics is the L2 norm between two differences in expected values. One is taken with respect to the training data and the other one with respect to the test data. After that, we define the density ratio function, which is the ratio between the test and the train probability density functions. And by using the definition of the probability densities, we find some natural constraints. Therefore, we obtain an optimization problem, but with constraints. By simple manipulations of the expected values, we obtain here the identity one. In fact, relates the expected value in the test data with the expected value in the training data. I will call this a loss function approach because if you look at identity one and the objective function in KMM, we observe that for the true density ratio function, the objective function is equal to 0. And in practical application, we need to minimize it because we use an approximation to the density ratio function. Here is denoted with hat R. So this is the idea behind the loss function approach. We define an objective function which is 0 from the point of view of the true density ratio. And then we minimize it in practical applications. Now, the idea behind KMM is that it reduces to a quadratic optimization problem with constraints. This is very simple because one replaces the integrals from the definition of expected values with empirical averages. It is quite interesting that the minimization problem is taken with respect to the approximate model, but in the training samples. This differs for the rule-sieve method from 2 points. Even though rule-sieve method, it is known in the literature, reduces also to a quadratic optimization problem, there are 2 main differences. First of all, rule-sieve utilizes the mixture of the train and test densities inside the definition of the true density ratio. And second of all, the approximate model takes a simple form. It is a linear kernel model. Here, the kernels, in fact, are Gaussian kernels, are taken with respect to the test samples. So in this way, we reduce the dimensionality, because in the KMM method, we had the optimization problem with respect to the training samples, and here with respect to the weights. But since we have an inner product, we have with respect to the test samples. Now, in order to extend the KMM method, let's consider the following case. Let's say that we have multiple test data sets and a single train data set, and we define the density ratio function as a mixture of density ratio functions that depend on each subset. By using some algebraic manipulations, we find this chain of equalities, and by using the aforementioned loss function approach, we reach this objective function. I will emphasize again that using this chain of equalities, the loss function is actually equal to 0 when one is working with the true density ratio function. There is an alternative method to this, namely, we can define for each subset a density ratio function from which we infer a suitable objective function. Evidently, the final loss function, it is a weighted summation of those. This, in fact, resembles very well the idea behind the paper Ensemble KMM, but we do not use here the parallelization process. In fact, we can use it, but we opted for writing in a final objective function. For the second case, let's take, for example, a single test data set and multiple train subsets. Again, we define for each subset a density ratio. We have also a chain of equalities. We observe here that the expected value in the test with respect to the test data is a weighted summation of expected values, but with respect to each train subset. Again, using the loss function approach, we obtain a suitable objective function. So for both these cases, we obtained a suitable objective function. Again, we can have an alternative method for the case of multiple train data sets. I will not insist only on this, only to say that in this case, we define a single true density ratio function, so it's much more practical from an application point of view. and we reach a different function, a different objective function. The main idea is, one may wonder, what is the relationship between these objective functions? In fact, one can easily show that for a particular case of the mixture weights, these two loss functions are equal. So even though we can develop in a rigorous manner an optimization problem, this can be done in multiple ways. Now, for the idea of the density ratio estimator, here it was proposed originally for RuleSIF, so not for KMM. But I wanted to extend it also to the different KMM variants. We can define it in two ways. Instead of the two density ratio function, we can replace it with a generalized variant here. But also it reduces to the particular case of multiple train subsets. Let's imagine that we have a training data and a test data, and the training data is split into multiple subsets. Then we obtain exactly the case of the alpha relative density ratio function. But it is worth noticing the following. In the previous analysis, I have used the assumptions from the Ensemble KMM paper. Namely, I used non-overlapping subsets. This method is not rigorously developed. This is due to the fact that it is impossible from a practical point of view, or useless, that the test data must not overlap at all the training data. So this one, I mention again, is not rigorous. Now, for the G-KMM algorithm, the idea is simple. We can combine the case of multiple train subsets with the case of multiple test subsets. For this, we define the training ratio as a ratio between mixture functions, in fact, combinations of the test densities and the train densities. But at the same time, we take the approximate density ratio model as a linear kernel model, as in the case of RuleSIF. For this, we take the Gaussian kernels defined at the test samples. So we reduce the dimensionality for the training data, as in the case of KMM, to the RuleSIF case. After some computations, we obtain the following optimization problem with constraints. So this is a generalization of KMM. But what is interesting is that by using these notations, by developing some heavy computations, and by defining this capital C vector, which is a weighted sum of Gaussian kernel, we obtain actually also a quadratic optimization problem. I mentioned that the constraints were inspired by the KMM original implementation. And if someone is interested in the implementation, you can check this GitHub link. In fact, I have used the CVXPy package in order to solve this optimization problem. I also want to highlight the fact that in this quadratic optimization problem, the matrices are defined with respect to every pair between train subsets and test subsets. Now, I will talk a little bit about the experiments that I have done. The first one is related to some clusters which were defined in scikit-learn. They are called blobs. At the top of the plots are the training subsets, and at the bottom the test subsets. There is a striking difference between the G-KMM method, our method, and the classical KMM method. The classical KMM method puts emphasis on certain points on the boundary of between the training data and the test data, while the G-KMM method, which takes into account the variance of different subsets, for example, puts emphasis on much more points on the boundary. Also, here in the last case, when you see sigma equal to none, sigma is taken as the default value from scikit-learn. Here and in the experiments which I will talk about, sigma is in fact related to the variance of the Gaussian kernels. Now, for the next experiments, I have used some synthetically generated data. In fact, I have used only Gaussian distributions. In each pair of plots, you can see the visualization of the distributions, and in the right plot, the comparison of two linear regression methods. One regression method is based, in fact, is fitted on the training data, and the other one is fitted on the weighted training data with the weights given by our algorithm G-KMM. In this case, we have multiple trained data sets and a single test data set. Let's look at the plots from the first row. In the left plot, we took sigma equal to 0.1, and we observe a uniform-like distribution with 3 peaks, each peak corresponding to a trained subset. Now, if we increase sigma to 1 and we put an alpha coefficient to the mixture density ratio, we obtain a lower mean absolute error, so a better result. And in the last plot, if we take an extreme value, so a large value for sigma, we observe that we do not make a lower mean absolute error. So sigma is a critical parameter. Now, for the case, let's say the case of multiple test subsets, it's much more interesting because here I took sigma with a higher value, 100, in all these experiments. And if we look in the left plot from the first row, we observe that there is not much of a difference in mean absolute error, and the peak of the weighted training samples are located with respect to the second test subset. Why? Because this test subset overlaps the training data. But if we put, this is quite interesting, that if we put an alpha mixture coefficient, we obtain worse results and a larger peak, so a peak with a larger magnitude. We, in the last simulation from the second row, we took here the same coefficients as before, but we moved the Gaussian training distribution with 0.5. So we moved the mean of the Gaussian distribution. In this case, the training data overlaps both of these subsets. So we obtain, it is very interesting, a uniform-like distribution and a better mean absolute error. So a lower mean absolute error for the regression model that uses the weighted samples. The last experiment combines the previous one. We have here 3 trained subsets and 2 test subsets. In the first row, we took sigma equal 0, 1 in the left plot and sigma equal 10 in the right plot. In the left plot is obvious that there are 3 peaks corresponding to the 3 trained subsets, while by increasing a little bit sigma to 10, we obtain only 2 peaks in the weighted distribution corresponding to the 2 test subsets. Why? Because they overlap the first and the third training subset. And also we obtain a lower mean absolute error. Finally, in the last row, we simply showed that putting some particular values on the mixture coefficients, which are the weights from the test densities, we obtain not only better mean absolute error, but by swapping the values here, we swapped also the peaks. So the magnitude of the peaks changed. Finally, I want to stress out a little bit about the conclusions of the method. There are some aspects regarding the novelty, namely, except the alpha density ratio technique, all these were developed in a rigorous manner using what I call the loss function approach. And I also used here a linear kernel model for the approximation of the true density ratio. Hence, the optimization problem is made with respect to lower dimensional space. This is because, in general, let's say we have practical applications, the training data due to augmentations is much higher, has much number of samples than the test data. But there are also some disadvantages, like we lose the parallelization of the ensemble KMM and the efficient KMM. And also, we have the same hyperparameters as in the kernel min matching algorithm, which appear in the constraints of the optimization problem. But these disadvantages can be leveraged. Why? Because we propose for future research to use neural networks instead of linear kernel models. We have flexibility in and versatility in the structure of neural networks, and also there is the advantages of the batch sizes. We can increase the batch size if we have enough computational resources. Also, like in a recent paper, our method can be combined with a classifier. Namely, we can train a classifier at the same time with the G-KMM density ratio method. In this way, we can use the weights from the G-KMM at each step of the loss classifier function. Finally, these are the references that I have used regarding the density ratio estimation methods and the CVX/Y package. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.